We're done animating and ready to render. We'll create two render jobs. The main test render job will be a fast rendering animation to check for mistakes. The main final render job will be the final frame sequence. Go to the Render Task Mode. Right-click the Render Jobs category and add component of this type. Name the render job Main Final. This render job will use the main camera and a new render options. Edit the render options to open the render options editor. Name the options Main Final to match the render job. To render the entire animation, start at 0 seconds, end at 20 seconds. Go to the File Output page and add an output event. Ping is the default format and a good lossless one. We could render the animation directly to AVI or QuickTime, but these formats have limitations and are not recommended for final output. AVIs and QuickTime movies cannot be rendered on several machines and may lose rendered output if the computer crashes before the render job is complete. These formats are best used for tests, as we will see shortly. Enter Main Final in the image file name field, and the job is ready for rendering. We have a main final render job with its main final render options. Let's clone them for main test use. First of all, Render Jobs, right-click Main Final, and Clone. Rename it Main Test. Render Options, Main Final, right-click, Clone. Rename it Main Test. And we're going to do a couple things to make this render more quickly, since it is supposed to be a test just to give us a sense of what the animation is doing. First of all, a smaller frame size. So select Scale, H for half, and 320 by 480 drops down to 320 by 240. The other thing we'll do is reduce the frame rate. So instead of 30 frames per second, make it 6 frames per second. On the File Output page, change Ping to AVI and rename the image file Main Test. We need to associate the main test render options with the main test render job. So go to the Scene at a Glance, Main Test, click, drag, and drop on Main Test Render Job. Make sure that VNS has the same idea. Apply Main Test Render Options to Main Test Render Job. Yes, sir. OK. We are ready to render the test animation. So we can go ahead and close out the editors here. We don't need them. And open Render Control. We don't need the Island Render Job. Disable that. Or No Tower. Disable that. And this is just the main test render pass, so disable Main Final. And that leaves us with just Main Test. Go to start rendering. VNS warns us that we're about to render an animation with a fractal depth set to Variable. Variable is the default method and appropriate for rendering single images. It is not appropriate for animation, which we'll talk about in the next tutorial. For now, take my word for it and select depth maps. And we need to generate them. And here, VNS wants to know, where do we start? 0, good place to start. Last frame, 600, good place to end. An interval of 5 frames, that's good. And once we do that, you'll be able to watch VNS moving through the animation in the real-time views. And what it's doing is going through the animation and keeping track of which terrain polygons pass near the camera and which ones stay distant. The render engine then uses the resulting map to subdivide the terrain polygons which optimizes rendering time and terrain detail. Once again, that may not make a whole lot of sense now, but in the next tutorial, when we start looking at how VNS renders, this will become much more clear. The status window will tell us how we're doing in the fractal depth map generation process. And when we're done, the video compression window will pop up because we are rendering to AVI, so Windows needs to know, well, how do you want to compress this? Let's stay with full frames, so go ahead and click the OK. And once you do that, VNS needs everything it has to have, and it's on to rendering. Render control will show render progress as it goes through frame by frame. This will probably take about 45 minutes, give or take. So take a break, and we'll come back when VNS is done. It took about 45 minutes to render off the main test AVI. If you'd like to look at the one I came up with, it's on the VNS3 DVD in the animation folder. Everything looks good in the test animation. So it's back to render control for main final rendering. And this is going to render off the final frame sequence. So disable main test because we need main final. Enable it. Make one last check of the settings and let's go for render. This will probably take several hours. So take the rest of the day off and we'll check back later. It took about 3 hours to render 601 frames. The assembled main final QuickTime movie is in the animation folder on your VNS3 DVD.